Welcome back to the Group Practice Accelerator podcast, brought to you by Polaris Healthcare Partners, where we leverage decades of healthcare and business experience to drive growth in successful group practices just like yours. If you're a healthcare entrepreneur and you're interested in building, scaling, or exiting your group practice, you found not only the industry's leading resource for business education, but a team of trusted advisors dedicated to helping you achieve and exceed your goals. In short, the team at Polaris creates clarity, confidence, and results. I'm your host, Jamie Falasz, and the Group Practice Accelerator podcast is on the air. Hey everyone, thanks for joining me for this week's episode because we've got a great guest who's really going to get you thinking today. And I can't believe that we're well into February already. And our team has been all over the map, from our own clinical development course in our masterclass in Charlotte to another year presenting at CareStack Inner Circle recently, to a massive 3+ hour presence and a workshop at AADGP. And then next month, as you know, we're co-hosting an event for group practice leaders with Midmark, and Dwalker and the team have been speaking at some really great events already this year. So we're grateful to all of you that have joined us, and I wanted to take a moment to just say thank you. But if somehow you've missed us, you can always check where we'll be next by hopping over to the events tab on our website for more info. And there's still a little time to grab a seat at the Midmark event at the end of March. So on to today's topic. We talk a lot about transactions on this show. Everything from guidance on how to position your business before going to sale, advisory on the sale itself, and even before all of that, how to build smartly and protect what you build, and how to align all that with a vision and your strategic plan you've created for your future, right? So your life plan, and even though selling might not be in your immediate future, or maybe it is, and you're thinking like to take advantage of changes in the market, everyone's plan has to include preparation for what their exit's going to look like. Because one, nobody lives forever. And two, rarely does anyone want to work forever. So it's critically important to not only look at the front end of the transaction, which, is very common, but that initial sale, and I'm air quoting, but we have to be equally diligent about what approach we take and how we look at the back end as well, meaning, what happens after the transaction, because there is just as much to examine on the tail end, especially considering that the tail end can extend on for some time, depending on the details of your specific exit and your contract, of course. And since I'm certainly no attorney and I don't even play one on TV, today's guest is going to guide us through some of the elements of a transaction that you need to be thinking about regardless of your timeline. He's an expert in the legal world, and he focuses on transactional work in the healthcare space, including dental, medical aesthetic, veterinary, and a whole lot more. So please help me welcome Justin Marti, founder and attorney at Marti Law Group, to the show. Justin, good to have you behind the mic.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. I'm excited to get going.
All right. Well, welcome. So we'll just jump right into it. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about you and a little bit about Marti Law Group?
So it's interesting. I think, most people look at legal as kind of this necessary evil, right? Of like, oh, I'm doing a transaction, I gotta hire a lawyer. And it's like, um, and so I think our take comes from my personal experience. So I do, of course, now have a law firm, right? And I have this complex sometimes where I'm like, "Yeah, I'm a lawyer, but," and I think the but is I've been in the shoes of some of these sellers, and practice owners. That comes from I started at DSO, for our dental folks out there, basically an MSO, management support organization for our dental group. Started it, long before I knew what a DSO was. I partnered with a dentist in Boston in 2007 or 8. I'm dating myself. We started with one location, right? And I was managing, and I had this dentist who did dentistry, and we scaled this thing up across the Northeast. We got to 45 locations, and it was kind of this wild ride over 12 years. And we exited. We had a kind of the dream, right? The private equity exit, and after that, for some reason, I'm a sucker for punishment, I guess. I decided, what sounds fun would be practicing law. So I was in law school actually while we had the business growing, but not really planning on practicing. But what I kind of learned in our exit process, I think, is what pushed me to be like, you know what, there's a lot of blind spots in a transaction, especially life after the transaction. There's just so much I mean, I kind of was ignorant going into the process and didn't really know a whole lot about like what are reps and warranties and indemnification, like what are these terms that put me to sleep. And so now I always warn people like it's a legal talk, a legal podcast. So I apologize. I'll try not to be too, nerd out too much on the legalese, but they're also super important. And so having gone through our process, kind of having seen some of the things that come up after the fact, you get a payday, that's great, but, you carry with you liability still that I think I didn't realize at the time you carry. And, you can actually lobby for limitations on things. So that really pushed me to want to play in this space and we represent buyers and sellers. But certainly for our sell side folks, have them think about some of the things long term, not just like, how do I get the max, EBITDA valuation? And, I think DeWalker and the Polaris team are very good at that. We want to take over from there and make sure you're protected, Doc. So hopefully you keep that money. So long-winded kind of backstory as to how we got, where we are now and what our, why we focus on what we do.
Yeah, because a lot of people don't start a group practice or DSO and then suddenly decide, "Hey, I think I'm gonna practice law." But that said, I can see how that would have given you some really specific and valuable insight to wanna go out there and protect people from, I hate to say themselves, but themselves,
Yep.
really. I mean,
Yep.
that's what it is
Absolutely.
because and that's not a dig on anybody. It's just you can't be expected to be all things in all situations. You can't be a legal expert and an amazing CEO or dentist at the same time. That's way too many hats to wear. So
Yeah.
thank you. We appreciate your experience.
Awesome. Awesome.
Well, why don't we frame this in a five things you need to know kind of format? And we'll kind of look at maybe, what you need to be thinking about when you're selling your practices, organization, or even maybe part of it, right? Because sometimes it's not the whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's so much to consider and without, like I said, putting people to sleep, we try to really hone in on what are the key things that you might not know as, you're a busy practicing physician or practicing dentist that you're not really thinking about long-term exposure sometimes.
Mhm.
So we often work closely with the broker, with the sell side rep, and with the provider as kind of this team and CPA really as well to issue spot before we get too far down the road. Some of the terms that I've already referenced, right? Like representations and warranties. People are like, what are, reps and warranties? What is this? They're basically promises, promises that each side are making to each other. So you've got a 20, 30, maybe 40-year business. There's a lot of historicals there. There's, some great goodwill you've built, and there could be some skeletons in the closet. So, our job is, again, reviewing documents, sure. There's great AI out there, right? And now people are like, maybe I don't even need to hire a lawyer. So I think our value is not in so much drafting the documents, but digging into this and like being an advocate for the doctor, for the seller in this case. And so reps and warranties are these promises they're making to the buyer. What does that mean? Are there any outstanding liabilities? Back taxes, stuff happens, right? When you've had a practice long enough, compliance issues. Did you get a slap on the wrist from, the dental board at one point in time? I always tell folks like they get nervous to disclose things to us, and I let them know we're number one, we're obviously not here to judge you, but we just want to stay ahead of it because the buyer will probably find out one way or the other, when they do their diligence. So, like, let's just disclose these things that happen. Again, when you see thousands of patients, stuff will come up, and that's okay, doc, but let's just get ahead of it, frame the story kind of correctly, as to what happened. Did it get resolved? So, we want to kind of go through that backstory a little bit and make sure we understand here's the promises you're making to this buyer that you're legally going to be bound to, so if something gets uncovered later on, they're going to come back and say, hey, seller, you kind of told me this tax situation was handled. It looks like it's not. And again, those are things that I just didn't know, right? Like when I was going through my process. And then it actually plays into the next thing, which is indemnification. Solid PE backed ESO buyer will have really strong indemnification for themselves. And really any buyer, they're again, the practice has been around 20, 30, 40 years. Stuff happens. They want to make sure they're protected from things that could come up after the fact, right? A claim gets filed from something 3 years ago, right? A patient decides, you know what, today is the day I'm going to, go after Dr. Jamie. So the buyers obviously want to be protected and they want the seller to indemnify them or protect them. But oftentimes the it's not mutual, right? So the seller doesn't have the same protection. So if we're representing sell side, we're like, okay, great buyer, we get it. At the same time, we want to be protected from stuff that happens after you take over.
Right.
So, again, and this was a big piece with us that I just didn't think about. I'm like, we sold, hands are clean, this is
Yeah.
great, let's move on. And
Yeah, it's
next
not
week,
often. It's just a mic drop and we're like, "Well, I'm out."
right,
You really have to know what you're guaranteeing people from both
right.
sides, like you said.
Correct, correct. And we've had situations where I always get nervous. Like I love our clients, right? But when I hear from like a doctor who sold and like a year and a half later, I see their name on my email and or my phone ringing, I'm like, oh boy, this might not be a good thing. So, we want to work through that. And then probably the last thing I'll say about, what we try to do to mitigate some of this exposure is we use something called like a cap or a basket. Very technical, like again, trying not to put people to sleep, but really it's a limitation on your exposure. So we'll get an offer or a purchase agreement, right, from a DSO or from an MSO buyer, and they want the liability to kind of be uncapped, right? So I get it. A claim gets filed against the MSO or the DSO. They want to be able to go, well, doctor, this happened when you owned it. You got to be on the hook with us. So we try to put some limitations on that, right? So again, when I sold, we didn't have we didn't really have any sort of cap. A patient comes in with a $500 refund and our phone rings, right? And the next patient comes in with a, small claim thing, our phone. Whereas now what we do is we negotiate for these docs to say, okay, like you're going to be liable for stuff that happened, but like let's put limits. So your phone doesn't ring until the buyer's incurred like a certain amount of stuff. And so it's like these little kind of levers that we pull to try and protect the seller. They're never going to be, I think a lot of them, again, they think kind of they wash their hands of it. They're good. You really never, and I try to articulate that to them. You're never fully free of anything that happened. At some point in time, maybe we can draw a line in the sand and be like, it's been 5 years and we negotiated all. But some things do follow them, more like big legal issues can kind of follow them and they'll carry that. So same thing if we're on the buy side, we kind of draft documents and we understand that the seller is going to want these protections in place. So it's kind of that give and take.
And it has to be protective of both sides, truly, because I mean, you can have somebody that, doesn't want to deal with all these, what they'll view as little nitpicky things, but those nitpicky things will protect you in the long run. You can't just leave all that to chance. And really no one in a smart transaction would. And it seems like you've seen quite a bit here. I'd love to hear stories.
Yeah, we definitely have stories, and I agree. I mean, we're not the type of firm, we don't. We oftentimes do stuff for flat fee, so like we're incentivized to get work done efficiently.
Yeah.
And we don't like to fight just to fight, but there are things that we have to explain to a seller. This is why this is important, because this. And part of the lawyer's role, right? We have to think of all the terrible things that hopefully never happen, but we got to like map them out for people,
Yeah.
and go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, all right, now the wire hits. You finish your sale, you've sold your, let's call it 20 location group. Post sale responsibilities. Tell me about those.
Yeah. So if, as you probably know, if you're doing kind of a DSO deal, there'll be that it's like three legs, that three-legged stool, right? There's going to be the purchase agreement that we negotiate. There's going to probably be an employment agreement of some sort. And then probably some equity, that the seller is rolling into the new company. So, analyzing the different components of those agreements are really important. We will see oftentimes a lot of money kind of dangled in front of sellers that, hey, as long as your practice performs, you're going to get this earnout and more money down the road. And there's a lot that goes into that. So I think, if we start with employment agreements, this is a tricky concept for someone who's owned a business for 30 years, as it is. They've gone from, I tell them, like, doctor, emotionally, so you're prepared. You're going to walk out on Friday, you're the owner, you walk in on Monday, you're an employee,
Mm.
right? And that could be a hard pill to swallow.
Yeah.
Um, a good DSO, of course, or a good MSO or a good buyer is not going to like change your culture over the weekend. Well, but, still, there's a little, you might have to put in for PTO now. So these are some things we want to think about, just like high level, kind of an emotional state. As we dig into the documents, again, now we're really looking at this like from an employment lens or from an employee lens. And we want to see, okay, what are the ways that they can terminate you? Um, for kind of, we said for cause, right? Like bad actor stuff versus Justin came in this quarter zip that we didn't like today and we think we want to let him go. So we really get into the weeds on that. And both sides, how can the doctor decide to walk away and do they leave all their equity on the table? So these are things that when everyone's focusing on, getting that payday, it's great, but like let's not rush through what life will be like for probably 5 years after, because most of the buyers are gonna want a nice 3 to 5-year window of that doctor sticking around.
Mm.
And like I mentioned earlier, earnouts. Earnouts are fantastic, performance-based, compensation motivates for sure, and so it keeps the doctor interested, keeps the team going, but we wanna see, is it obtainable, and I think sometimes we have to really check what the operation will look like after the fact and they're all kind of interrelated, right? So is the buyer going to come in and lay on a bunch of debt or a bunch of management fees that will then hurt the doc's ability to get their earnout? So it's kind of like these pieces of the puzzle. So we'll look at that. Really dive into like, hey, if we pull this lever, it actually could hurt you here. Sometimes we have doctors who want, they want a really strong flat salary, but as DeWalker and the team can say, is like, cool, we can get you that doc, but it's going to lower your valuation exponentially. So we kind of work through those things. Again, we're not brokers. I always say like, sure, let's grab
Right.
the advisor to make sure that like everyone stays in their lane. And probably a final thing to touch on, again, life after the wire hits is the restrictive covenant. As people know, and when I say that, I mean non-competes, non-solicitation stuff. It's one of the most hotly contested issues across the country in employment law. It's a little different. I try to tell folks like there's your non-compete in the context of your employment when you're working for the buyer. There's also your non-compete for selling your practice, right? And like the law looks at these things very separately. So there's a lot more restriction on in some states, California, non-competes are unenforceable. Massachusetts, they're unenforceable against physicians. Like we work in 50 states, so we try to keep track of all the things that are happening. But in most states, they're enforceable if they're reasonable, which is like the most like arbitrary lawyer term you've ever heard. Like what is
Yeah, that's a
reasonable?
little gray.
Little gray, yeah, and we love gray, right? Because we're like, "Oh, it depends." So yeah. So in employment terms, it's something we wanna look at. We have to really consider some of the elements. When you're selling your practice, though, they are much more enforceable because, in the eyes of the court, it's like, "Hey, you got, multiple millions of dollars, doc. Like, yeah, you should not go open down the road." So those are things we wanna talk through as well.
Yeah, those are elements that want to make sure that, hey, you're going to sell your practice, open one across the street, and look at what that does to the existing practice. We have rules for a reason. Why don't we talk about some of the really common, like sell side pitfalls that you see? Can you run through what some of those would be?
Yeah, I think these are super important for us to touch on and for folks to think about early in their process. The first I'm going to say, just try to have a lawyer glance at your LOI before you sign it. You don't have to, and for the most part, an LOI is non-binding. You hear that a lot. There are components of it that will be binding, and mostly it's tied to you're entering an exclusive relationship with this potential buyer, right? This suitor. So you can't really shop it around to other buyers, maybe. Confidentiality, you're going to share stuff that, I mean, that works to a seller's advantage, but there are some things you're going to be bound to. What we have found is the doc signs an LOI, they come to us and they're like, yeah, I agreed to, $1 million, but I think, can we get it to 1.5? And so right away I'm like, well, let's call DeWalker. Let's get the advisor on the phone because I know nothing about your valuation. That's not my world. My finance degree is now 25 years old. So let's bring in the folks who know, So I always say if they can have us just glance at the LOI prior to signing, great. And we never really, I don't think we've ever like gone to town redlining a letter of intent, but it's nice to actually just see kind of what we're working with and address concerns there. Corporate structure is something I'm seeing more of. Corporate structure issues, I guess, is something I'm seeing more of lately, particularly as we work with larger groups. So if we have a multi-location practice, a dental group or med spa group that's selling to, to a PE backed organization, sometimes it can be sloppy, right? It can be there's like this cap table of owners here and over there. There's like, different owners and it kind of funnels up. Sometimes it's like a pseudo DSO structure. So looking at that early or having your legal team look at it early, I think is pretty important because we've actually seen some deals as of late where they kind of dinged the seller a little bit for, the cleanup they were going to have to do, they being the buyer. right? So they're like, "Doc, we love your practice. This is great. Unfortunately, it's a mess, and we've got to do some cleanup." So they actually, knocked them down a little bit as far as evaluation, which I was really surprised to see. But I think it could have been avoided if we just kind of early on looked at it together with the client and
Yeah.
kind of clean up this cap table here, do that. Now you present a nice clean package to the buyer.
Playing devil's advocate here, it doesn't seem horribly unfair to ask that someone come in with a clean cap table and having all of their ducks in a row rather than having to do it after the fact. And it's got to make
Right.
the transaction just go that much more smoothly, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think a lot of the buyers realize, like, if this entity was formed, 10, 20, 30 years ago, like, there's gonna be some mess to it, but
Yeah.
it's interesting that lately, diligence and I'm sure your team is, Polaris team has seen, like, there's just been a lot more diligence, and people are diving a lot deeper, and, if they can save a few bucks on an acquisition, they are, so that's something we wanna look at. And then I think, Jamie, the last thing I would say as far as some of the pitfalls is kind of back to that point earlier of unresolved, like, lien. We say lien in litigation. So when we represent a buyer, we do what's called a lien in litigation search. It's kind of like a title search in a house. We wanna know, okay, someone owns this place. We want the mortgage to be paid off before, Jamie buys it. And so it's very similar. We want to know that our buyer is going to be protected and there's no outstanding debts. And so we like to be proactive, right, with the client and say, okay, like, let's go through if there's liens on your practice, which many of them have equipment loans and things like that. Let's go through and identify what they are. Let's start getting like payoff letters because it's going to come up either way, in diligence with the buyer.
Sure.
And even more so is the litigation. When, like, people get really nervous to be like, "Okay, I had this malpractice claim 7 years ago." And I'm like, "It's okay. Like, let's just talk about it." We wanna make sure we kind of explain it the right way to obviously, we're not gonna be misleading, but we wanna make sure we frame it the right way to the potential buyer so they're not, spooked. And most of them understand, again, this business has been around for a long time, stuff happens. We had 45 locations, believe me. We had a list of, like, in 2011, there was this. I learned a lot after going to law school.
I can
Um,
imagine.
but, I just like to tell them, like, diligence and, being really upfront with some of this stuff is really helpful in the process down the road.
Yeah, that makes complete sense to me. So, why don't we talk about risk management a little bit? How can sellers minimize their exposure and maximize their leverage?
This sounds a little, like, probably obvious, but it's, structuring smarter deal terms.
Sure.
And again, people are like, "Well, yeah, of course," but not in the sense of, work with Polaris to get a better earnout valuation. It's really like, um, let's consider the risk again long term. Especially if you're going to be signing an employment agreement, but really in either case, you're going to have these promises, like I talked about earlier, these reps and warranties, these things that are going to stay with you for a while. Let's get really clear on, like, can we put time limits on those? Can we say, okay, sure, buyer, I'm indemnifying you, but at 4 years, like, I'm off the hook, and some will be like, there's some kind of promises and indemnifications that you really like, they are unlimited. Again, they're usually more related to really terrible stuff like, fraud, misrepresentation, like all these terrible things that, legally you might be on the hook. But more so if we had a HIPAA violation, patient name got on a piece of paper and it was at the like, these things happen, but we want to try and draw a line in the sand and say, okay, like, this can't go past X number of years. So that's what I say when I'm like, we structure smarter deal terms. It's really not like what's your earnout look like, your employment agreement, but it's like, let's get into the weeds on this document. As painful as it is to do this legal stuff, it will hopefully save you down the road a lot of stress.
Well, yeah, no one likes surprises. So, if we can account for that up front, it just makes sense to do it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think holdbacks and earnouts, like I talked about before, they're a slippery slope. We get doctors who commit to numbers that I think are a little overzealous. I've had doctors at the finish line be like, Justin, you know what? I actually don't know if I can hit this earnout that I committed to. And I'm like, all right, well, we should probably talk about that before you sign,
Yes.
and everyone wants their cake and eat it too, right? I want the biggest earnout, but, I also am overcommitting. So I think a poorly structured holdback, or escrow can really tie things up after a deal. We want it to just be clean. Like, here's the numbers you got to hit, or sometimes there's a holdback. We call it for, like, a tax clearance. So we've got to send some documentation to the state. They're going to say, yep, Dr. Jamie paid her taxes. We released the money, but you just need it to be tight. And then probably the last thing is just how disputes are handled. Our firm does not litigate. We don't do disputes. We we close a transaction, stuff does happen, and we always tell doctors like, "Hey, we've got to bring in the litigators or, the big folks who like to go to court. I don't." And of course, we'll support them if they need information, right? But really having ironclad agreements has eliminated so much potential litigation we've seen in transactions over the years. We've seen the deals where the two doctors, did stuff on a handshake and there was no like paper trail to follow anything. So they end up in litigation. They spend a ton of money.
So much anxiety. I can't tell you.
Even still, we have deals we do where the other side won't get an attorney. And I'm like, sure, like, because then I would probably, it's really awkward for us actually. It ends up being a lot more work. So really having ironclad indemnification provisions as much of, and there's a fine line too. I mean, you don't want to go back and forth with the other side with the whole documents read and, it takes months to close. Like there's got to be a give and take. But we try to identify with our clients, like, what's your biggest risk up front? What's most important to you? Let's pull at those levers. Yeah, I mean, legal is, like I said, it can be an interesting endeavor, painful for a lot of the docs, but we try to make it as painless as we can.
Well, and that's really what you're doing is removing pain from your future state, right? So accounting for all of those things, even if it's in a 60, 70-page operating agreement, just to answer all those questions that could come up. I mean, I know that aggravates most people, but being a
Yeah,
former paralegal, I love these things.
I know.
The what if situation that, may never happen, but it has. So why don't we just prevent it from happening again?
Yeah,
Makes perfect sense in my brain, but
yeah, yeah. You might be in the minority, but I agree with
I think
you.
it
So.
might be. Yeah, I've been told that before, like, you're way in the weeds." I'm like, "But am I? Am I
Yeah,
really?" Well, Justin, thank you so much. This has been a great chat with you. If our listeners want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
You can hit our website, which is www.martilawgroup.com. It's Marti lawgroup.com. You can email me directly, Justin at Marti Law Group. Happy to have a chat with anybody if they're considering either a buy or a sale. We do a lot of partnership work as well, getting the associate to buy in, the succession plan type of work. So really anything transactional is what we love to do. So please, feel free to shoot an email or hit our website and you'll find our number there as well.
Awesome. I'll put all that in the show notes so you don't have to remember it right now. But we appreciate you coming on the show so much. Thanks for being with us here today.
Thank you. This is great.
And as always, if you'd like to schedule some time to learn about any of Polaris Expert Advisory Services, or maybe there's a topic that we haven't covered that you want to hear about, you can send us an email to info@polarishealthcarepartners.com, or you can reach us by visiting our website at polarishealthcarepartners.com. Go up to the upper right and click that Contact Us button, and we'll get back to you just as soon as we can. Thanks so much for being a loyal listener and subscriber. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a friend or colleague, and be sure to leave us a rating on your favorite podcast platform, including YouTube, where you can also now find videos of your favorite episodes. We'll see you on the next episode of the Group Practice Accelerator Podcast.